Marcus Devereux stood at the threshold of the Grand Draxian Senate Hall, feeling the weight of the moment, though his expression betrayed none of it. He had been trained to remain unshaken, even when faced with the most impossible of odds. Behind him, the vast expanse of Elendor's crimson sky stretched to the horizon, but inside, in the heart of the imperial capital, Marcus had only one focus: the negotiation. To most, it appeared as a diplomatic mission, a fragile attempt at peace between two rival species. But for Marcus, it was anything but. In reality, the peace treaty was a carefully crafted lie. His true mission, one only a select few knew, was to sabotage the Draxian Empire from within. This was not an ordinary peace negotiation, it was a high-stakes game where the lives of millions depended on the success or failure of his operation. The Draxians, aware of the increasing human presence in galactic politics, had no interest in genuine peace. They only saw opportunity in subjugation, and Marcus knew their agenda. The only way to stop them was from within. "Your Excellency, it is with the deepest respect that I stand before you today," Marcus said smoothly, his voice calm, almost rehearsed, as he addressed Chancellor Korthak, the towering leader of the Draxian Empire. He had studied their culture, their language, and their rituals for years, understanding the delicate balance of power that governed every interaction. The Draxians prized strength and control above all else. Marcus would need to navigate this carefully. This treaty is not merely a formality, but a chance to ensure the prosperity of both our peoples. There's more to be gained in cooperation than in continued hostility. Korthak, a creature of scales and 6 gleaming eyes, studied him intently, the slightest hint of suspicion flickering in his alien gaze. His massive frame shifted, and the low rumble of his voice reverberated through the room. "Charming words, human. But we have yet to see the value in this treaty. Your kind have a reputation for underhanded dealings." Marcus felt the weight of the challenge, but he was prepared. "And yet, you still invited us here, did you not?" A silence followed. Korthak's eyes narrowed, and Marcus knew he had hit a nerve. The Draxian Empire was built on the notion of superiority, anything that threatened that was met with aggression. And yet, here Marcus was, a mere human, calmly negotiating with the most powerful figure in the galaxy. "Your arrogance precedes you," Korthak continued, his words dripping with contempt. "You think we would bow to such a fragile treaty? Your diplomats are merely pawns, easily manipulated." Marcus didn't flinch. He wasn't merely a diplomat, and he wasn't here to play the part of a pawn. Beneath the polished exterior, Marcus Devereux was an operative of the Black Hand, Earth's most secretive and dangerous agency, tasked with neutralizing threats before they reached the public's awareness. His mission was not to make friends, it was to destroy the Draxian Empire, piece by piece, before they could further their plans of conquest. But even the best-trained agents needed to blend in. Marcus knew that his outward behavior was crucial. He needed to maintain the illusion of diplomacy while setting the stage for the destruction of a galactic empire. His charm was not a weapon, but a necessity. The Draxians had to believe they controlled the situation, that they held the power. Only then could he strike. As the conversation continued, Marcus's mind never strayed from his objective. He had studied the Draxians' military infrastructure, their political structure, and their advanced weapons systems. He knew where the cracks were. He knew where to hit. He had already begun planting the seeds for his sabotage, carefully and methodically, in places the Draxians would never suspect. It was only a matter of time before the Empire would implode from the inside, and Marcus would be the invisible hand guiding that collapse. The meeting dragged on, and despite the growing tension, Marcus remained composed, his every word chosen with care. The Draxians grew increasingly irritated by his calm demeanor, as though they couldn't fathom how a human could maintain such poise under pressure. But they didn't understand. He was a trained operative, his composure was his greatest weapon. The Draxians were a people of raw aggression, but Marcus knew that their fatal flaw was their overconfidence. They thought they were untouchable, incapable of being outwitted by a mere human. And that was precisely where they would fall. It was during the final moments of the meeting that Marcus felt the first true attempt on his life. A subtle movement from one of the Draxian attendants caught his attention, an assassin, carefully concealed, moving toward him with a hidden blade. The Draxian had been ordered to kill Marcus before he left the hall. The Empire couldn't risk allowing a human diplomat to walk away unharmed, not when he was so close to their most powerful leaders. Marcus's instincts flared, but his face remained a mask of indifference. He had anticipated this. He had expected this. The Draxians were too proud to consider that their charming human guest might be more than he appeared. The assassin moved in with lightning speed, but Marcus was already a step ahead. His hand subtly shifted beneath the table, activating the hidden tech built into his jacket. The room was filled with a soft hum as his personal shield deployed. The assassin's blade was no match for the force field, which deflected the strike effortlessly. Marcus had already calculated the trajectory of the attack, positioning himself to disarm the would-be assassin with a fluid, practiced motion. Before the Draxian could even react, Marcus had neutralized him, sending the body crashing to the floor. The room erupted into chaos, the Draxians scattering as they attempted to make sense of what had just transpired. Marcus, calm as ever, stood and adjusted his jacket, smoothing out the creases as if nothing had happened. To them, it seemed like an unfortunate accident, an outburst from a rogue assassin. But Marcus knew the truth. This was only the beginning. As he exited the Senate Hall, his steps were steady, his mind already planning the next phase of the mission. He had survived the first test, but the Draxians would soon realize that they were playing a far more dangerous game than they could comprehend. And Marcus would be there, in the shadows, to pull the strings, until the entire empire was brought to its knees. The Draxians had made their first mistake. They assumed they could control Marcus Devereux, thinking him nothing more than a diplomatic pawn, easy to manipulate, weak by nature, and ripe for assassination. But Marcus had already seen the cracks in their arrogance, and he knew just how to exploit them. After the failed poisoning attempt, the Draxians regrouped, convinced their plan was merely flawed, not fundamentally wrong. They continued to underestimate the human they were dealing with. They'd chosen their assassin carefully, a Draxian operative named Zarek, renowned for his stealth and precision. He had been entrusted with eliminating Marcus during an official banquet. The plan seemed simple: find a moment when Marcus was distracted, vulnerable, and strike. To the Draxians, this was a typical solution to the human problem. The operative was confident, the humans were, after all, known to lack sophistication in battle. Marcus, however, was no ordinary human. He had been prepared for this very moment, this exact move. His training in the Black Hand had shaped him into a master of anticipation. He had anticipated the assassination attempts. He had anticipated their every move. The Draxians, for all their technological superiority and their immense empire, failed to grasp one crucial fact: humans had an uncanny ability to adapt, to think on their feet, and to outwit their opponents. As Marcus entered the banquet hall, his eyes scanned the room, observing every shift, every shadow, every subtle movement in the crowded space. He felt the weight of the Draxians' gaze on him. They still saw him as a diplomat, unaware that their next mistake was already in motion. Zarek waited in the shadows, his sleek, armored form barely perceptible against the dim lighting. His eyes tracked Marcus as the human made his way through the crowd, alone and unguarded. The assassin's pulse quickened. The moment was approaching. Zarek's thoughts were focused only on the kill, quick, clean, precise. He moved into position, silent as a shadow. He had rehearsed this. He would slip behind Marcus, extend the blade, and end the human's life with a single stroke. The Empire's fragile peace talks would be done, and the human threat neutralized. But Marcus Devereux had already read the play. He knew that the Draxians would never simply let him walk away from the table unharmed. He had known, as soon as he set foot on Elendor, that the attempts on his life were inevitable. His eyes flicked to the space near the corner, where Zarek stood poised, waiting for the right moment. Marcus could feel the tension in the air, the stillness just before violence struck. He moved swiftly, without hesitation, sidestepping just as Zarek launched himself from the shadows. The assassin's strike was quick, his blade slicing through the air with deadly intent, but Marcus was faster. He sidestepped the attack effortlessly, and as Zarek stumbled, his weapon aimed toward empty air, Marcus turned, grabbing the Draxian's arm and twisting it with an almost casual precision. The assassin grunted in surprise, but Marcus was already in control. Before Zarek could react, Marcus delivered a sharp elbow to his chest, knocking the wind out of him. The assassin crumpled to the floor, his blade sliding across the polished tiles. Marcus stood over him, his expression as cold as ever. The Draxians in the hall stood frozen in disbelief, unable to comprehend what had just happened. Their assassin, their chosen operative, had failed. Worse, he was lying on the floor, incapacitated by a single human. The power dynamics had shifted in that instant, but the Draxians had no idea just how far it had shifted. Marcus looked down at Zarek, who was struggling to regain his breath. "I believe you were looking for me," Marcus said quietly, his voice devoid of emotion. Zarek struggled to move, but his body refused to obey. You're not who you appear to be," the assassin gasped. Marcus didn't respond. He didn't need to. Instead, he signaled for the guards to take Zarek away, ensuring the Draxian's failed assassination attempt would not be swept under the rug. As the assassin was dragged away, Marcus' gaze swept over the stunned Draxian officials in the room, still reeling from the failed attack. The Draxian leadership, however, was not to be deterred so easily. Chancellor Korthak, despite his surprise, remained calm, though his voice carried a threat. "It seems, human, that your reputation precedes you. But this will not stop us." Marcus smirked inwardly. "They think they can intimidate me with threats." Outwardly, his expression remained neutral. "I suggest you rethink your approach," he replied, his voice smooth. "If you think your assassin was your last option, you are gravely mistaken." He turned to leave, but before he could take another step, Korthak's voice echoed through the hall. "We'll see if you can outlive your usefulness. Humans always fail in the end." Marcus stopped but didn't turn back. "I'm sure you'll try. But I won't be the one who fails, Chancellor." As Marcus made his exit, the room buzzed with whispers, but none of the Draxians dared approach him. They could sense that something had changed. They could feel the shift in the atmosphere, as though the weight of their underestimation had suddenly begun to dawn on them. The next few days were filled with increasing tension. The Draxian leadership had learned their lesson, but they still failed to recognize their true adversary. They continued to make their moves, confident that Marcus was nothing more than a target for their superiority to crush. But with each attempt on his life, Marcus's resolve grew stronger. The assassination attempts became more elaborate, the methods more sophisticated. Yet, each time, Marcus stayed one step ahead, outmaneuvering the Draxians with ease. He had anticipated their every move, every countermeasure, and it was only a matter of time before their empire began to crumble under the weight of their own hubris. Marcus had come here to end the Draxian Empire's reign of terror, and he was just getting started. The chessboard was set. The game had begun. And as the Draxians plotted his demise, Marcus Devereux, the human diplomat they underestimated, continued to play them all for fools. The Draxians were relentless, but Marcus had anticipated their persistence. They had underestimated him, assuming that one failed attempt would be enough to shake his composure. Instead, each failed plot only further cemented his resolve. He wasn't just a diplomat, not merely a negotiator caught in the web of galactic politics. He was Marcus Devereux, an operative of the Black Hand, the most covert and lethal force Earth had ever produced. And his mission had only just begun. Despite their blunders, the Draxian leadership could still not shake the idea that they controlled the situation. They began to believe that the human had somehow lucked his way through his previous encounters, and they were not about to let such a fortunate anomaly stand in their way. The more they schemed, the more desperate they became. It was becoming increasingly clear that they had no understanding of the man they were dealing with. The next attempt came days later, more subtle than the last. A Draxian engineer, posing as a civilian contractor, had been hired to tamper with Marcus's transport vehicle, a sleek, armored hovercraft that he used for his official travels between diplomatic meetings. The plan was simple: tamper with the vehicle's propulsion system, ensuring that it would explode during a routine journey. The device had been planted expertly, hidden deep within the mechanics of the craft. A brilliant plan, if you didn't account for Marcus's ability to spot an anomaly from a mile away. As Marcus prepared to leave for another round of meetings, he instinctively inspected the hovercraft, noticing the slight deviation in the fuel lines. A faint whiff of the wrong chemical drifted in the air, barely perceptible but enough to set off an alert in his mind. He had been in the field long enough to know when something wasn't right. The Draxians thought they had perfected their plan, but they had once again underestimated the human. Marcus turned the hovercraft's diagnostic system on, and sure enough, the readings were off. The propulsion system was rigged, the explosive device timed to detonate upon launch. With a practiced motion, Marcus shut down the ignition sequence, overriding the faulty system and isolating the bomb before it could activate. He then called in his security detail, having them sweep the vehicle for other traps. The Draxians, clueless to the fact that their trap had failed, would now be left wondering how their assassin had been foiled once again. The failed assassination only added to the growing tension within the Draxian leadership. Chancellor Korthak, though outwardly calm, was beginning to see a pattern emerge. He was no fool, and even though he would never admit it publicly, he realized that Marcus was more than a diplomat. This human was a threat, one he could not easily eliminate. In the aftermath of the second attempt, Marcus's role as a harmless negotiator began to shift in the eyes of the Draxian leaders. They had planned to kill him and be done with it, but now the situation had escalated. Marcus, though still playing his part, had begun to exert his influence over the very people who sought to destroy him. One Draxian officer, a high-ranking military strategist named Lirok, began to take notice of Marcus. Unlike the others, Lirok wasn't driven by simple bloodlust or the need to assert Draxian superiority. He was curious. The human, for all his apparent diplomatic charm, had survived 2 assassination attempts with unnerving ease. He had done so without so much as breaking a sweat, and Lirok's instincts told him there was more to Marcus than met the eye. Lirok had been in command of several covert operations for the Empire and had dealt with all manner of adversaries, but Marcus was different. He had heard rumors about Earth's so-called Black Hand, a shadowy organization that could execute its mission with surgical precision, but he had dismissed them as propaganda. Now, standing in the presence of the human diplomat, Lirok began to reconsider. This was no ordinary envoy. Marcus exuded a calm intensity that only the most dangerous of operatives could maintain. Every action he took, every word he spoke, was calculated. Marcus was not just playing the part of a diplomat. He was orchestrating the downfall of the Empire with each passing moment, weaving himself deeper into the Draxian system. Lirok's suspicion grew, but even he was not prepared for what would come next. The third attempt was an entirely new form of attack, one that involved a trap set within the very halls of the Draxian Senate itself. A bomb was hidden beneath the floorboards of the Senate chamber, a sophisticated detonator timed to trigger during Marcus's speech. The Empire had decided that a public death would send the message they desired: humans were no match for them, and the Empire would not bow to any form of peace. On the day of the Senate session, Marcus was well aware of the growing tension in the air. He had learned to read the subtle signs of danger long ago. He had already pinpointed the location of the device, based on his observations and his vast knowledge of Draxian architecture. As he stood before the Senate, ready to address the assembly, he made a slight adjustment to his diplomatic stance, just enough to set his personal shield into activation mode. His speech began smoothly, as planned, but Marcus was acutely aware of the ticking clock beneath him. The bomb was set to explode in 3 minutes. The Draxians watched him closely, their eyes locked on his every word, yet Marcus continued speaking as if nothing were amiss. His charm, his calm demeanor, were weapons in their own right. The Draxians believed they were in control, unaware that they were walking straight into a trap. With less than 30 seconds remaining, Marcus made a slight movement, just enough to trigger a hidden sequence in his suit. The personal shield flared to life, and in that same moment, he activated a remote device that disabled the bomb's timer. The Senate room, still silent with tension, was oblivious to the near catastrophe that had been averted. Marcus finished his speech, his voice steady, his mind already planning the next move. The Draxian officials sat in stunned silence, not knowing that their greatest adversary was playing them like pieces on a chessboard. As they deliberated among themselves, Marcus's eyes scanned the room, calculating his next steps. He could feel the shift in the atmosphere. The Draxians were becoming desperate, and in their desperation, they were becoming predictable. Marcus was no longer just a diplomat in their eyes. He had become the embodiment of everything they feared: clever, calculating, and lethal. The tension in the Senate chamber reached a fever pitch as Marcus continued to deliver his carefully crafted speech. His words, though diplomatically phrased, carried a weight far beyond the surface level. He spoke of peace, of cooperation, of a future where both species could prosper. The Draxian leaders, seated around him, listened with varying degrees of interest, some skeptical, some convinced that their own might would ultimately prevail. They were blind to the real purpose of his words: to buy time. Marcus knew the bomb was beneath the floor, set to explode in less than 5 minutes. The Draxians, ever sure of their technological supremacy, had believed this would be their final strike, a death that would end the human threat once and for all. They didn't realize that Marcus had already anticipated this last-ditch effort. Underneath the facade of diplomacy, Marcus was already moving. His mind raced, not with fear, but with calculation. His hand subtly touched a concealed device in his sleeve. The personal shield he had activated earlier buzzed quietly to life, its energy field strong enough to protect him from most conventional attacks. The bomb was clever, yes, but Marcus had studied the Draxians' weaponry, and he knew exactly how to disable it. His mind mapped out the room in an instant, the likely locations of other threats, and the escape routes he had already scouted. But first, he needed to outwit them one last time. He shifted his stance, a casual move that allowed his feet to adjust their position in alignment with a hidden panel in the floor. The timing had to be perfect. He had calculated the exact moment when the detonation mechanism would activate. He could feel the faint vibrations of the floor beneath him, the low hum of the trigger mechanism working its way through the building's infrastructure. His heart rate remained steady, his breathing controlled, just another day in the life of a highly trained operative. "Your Excellency, Chancellor Korthak," Marcus said, addressing the leader directly with the perfect amount of deference. "What if I told you that the true threat to the Empire lies not within the stars, but within the very foundations you've built your power upon? What if I told you that all the strength you possess could be undone by a single flaw in your own systems?" Korthak, ever the embodiment of Draxian pride, leaned forward slightly, his 6 glowing eyes narrowing. "You speak in riddles, human," he growled, his voice low and menacing. "You would do well to remember your place." Marcus smiled, ever so slightly, but it was enough to convey a quiet understanding. "I speak of truth. And I would do well to remember that I've already been where you cannot go." The silence that followed was palpable. The Draxians exchanged wary glances, some beginning to pick up on the odd rhythm in Marcus's voice. He was playing them, again, but this time, the stakes were far higher. They didn't yet realize that the moment they'd been preparing for had already slipped through their fingers. Suddenly, there was a low, barely audible beep, followed by a series of clicks. Marcus's internal sensor had detected the activation of the detonator. Without missing a beat, he leaned forward, his eyes scanning the room in a quick, deliberate motion. He made no overt movements, no signs of panic. To the untrained eye, he was still the composed, charming diplomat he had been from the start. But beneath the surface, Marcus was already moving, too fast for anyone to follow. With surgical precision, he tapped a few hidden commands into his wrist console, overriding the bomb's primary trigger and redirecting its detonation signal to a nullified sequence. The bomb, once destined to take out the entire Senate chamber, was now harmless, its explosive potential rendered inert. Marcus's personal shield hummed quietly, absorbing the energy from the blast that never came. As the bomb's threat dissolved, the Draxian senators remained oblivious, still believing that Marcus was unaware of their game. But now, the facade of diplomacy had crumbled entirely. There was no more pretending. They could not kill him by any of their standard methods. The peace talks were over. Marcus's voice cut through the stillness. Your Excellency, I do hope you've enjoyed the show. But I think it's time to get to the real matter at hand. He stood tall, every ounce of his training on full display as he addressed the stunned assembly. Korthak blinked, his confidence wavering for the first time since the beginning of the meeting. What do you mean, human? He hissed, though his voice held a threat of uncertainty now. It's quite simple, Marcus said smoothly, pacing before the council. You see, my role here was never about diplomacy, never about forging a false peace. My true task was far more intricate. You've allowed yourselves to become complacent, to think that the human race is beneath your notice. But it was never about your military might or your technology. It's about your vulnerability. Marcus paused for a moment, letting the words hang in the air. He could see the realization creeping into the eyes of some of the Draxian leaders. They were beginning to understand, Marcus was no diplomat. He was the executioner. Your empire, Marcus continued, is built on a foundation of arrogance, and in that arrogance, you've left open cracks that no one has bothered to patch up. Your weapons, your security systems, your very infrastructure, each one is vulnerable, each one can be undone, and I'm the one who will do it. The room was silent. The Draxians were processing, but they couldn't believe what they were hearing. Marcus was not here to negotiate, he was here to dismantle them, piece by piece, until there was nothing left of their empire but a shattered remnant. Korthak stood, his posture rigid with the weight of his growing understanding. You think you can bring us down from the inside? You will fail, he spat. Marcus met his gaze, his expression unreadable. I don't plan to fail. And you won't even know when it's happening. The time for your empire is running out. As he turned to leave, Marcus could already hear the chaos beginning to unfurl behind him. The Draxian leaders were scrambling, no longer able to grasp control. He didn't need to see it, he knew the truth. The Empire's power, once so absolute, was crumbling at the hands of one human.